In 2000, Ireland signed the Stockholm Declaration, and in doing so, as a nation, we undertook, along with other European partners and the wider international community, to ensure that the victims of the Holocaust would be remembered. Today, gathered as we are together, we give witness to that commitment.
Tonight we will recall the suffering inflicted on the Jewish people and those of other faiths during the Holocaust. We will reflect on this and will speak of our hopes that such acts of inhumanity will become fewer and fewer during our lifetime. This very important event is one of the first in the city's annual calendar. It is a date when we gather to remember the suffering of those who have gone before us, and it gives us an opportunity to also reflect on the suffering still being inflicted throughout the world.
In declaring that the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization, we share a commitment to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust and to honour those who stood against it.
Some of the finest works of German Jewish literature, history, philosophy, art and science were destroyed as Jewish cultural heritage was obliterated.
They couldn't ride on trams, go to the cinema, the theatre, or to the opera. Even if they could, they would not hear music written by Jews, played by Jews, or sung by Jews.
Out of all of the nations present at the Evian conference, none were willing to take in more Jewish refugees. With nowhere to turn, the Jews found themselves trapped within their own borders, and the Evian conference was deemed a failure.
91 Jews were murdered that night, and 30,000 Jewish men were thrown into concentration camps. After the destruction, the Jewish communities were fined 1 billion Reichmark to pay for the damage.
We were first sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and then to Bergen-Belsen, where we remained until liberation. My mother died of TB just after the British arrived. Terry and I were very young children and learned that we were the only two members of our family to have survived the Holocaust.
Ghettos were usually sited close to railways and often near killing sites or death camps. Many ghettos were walled in or fenced off, and Jews who left them without permission were severely punished.
They rounded up Jews in the shtetls, towns and villages, forcing them into cemeteries, forests and ravines, where thousands were murdered at point-blank range. Many had to dig their own graves before being shot into them.
As Nazi killing squads swept through Eastern territories, my family were incarcerated in the ghetto in the centre of the town. On the 3rd and 9th of November 1942, the Jewish population of Bilgoraj were dispatched to a certain and immediate death at the Belzak death camp.
The delegates debated at length who was Jewish according to bloodline considerations and discussed evacuation and resettlement of the Jews. They concluded that a more efficient method of murder was necessary, one that would produce little residue and spare those operating the killing sites the negative psychological trauma of face-to-face killing.
Prisoners were selected to live or to die. 90% were selected for death. They were ushered into undressing areas where they were told to leave their clothes neatly on the pegs provided and to tie their shoes together to make them easier to find when they came back from the showers. They never came back.
Endorsed by doctors and nurses, in the mass murder of disabled people, demonstrated with grim efficiency that a similar method of murder could be applied to others on a far larger scale.
Polish universities, scientific institutions, schools, museums, and libraries were closed down. Polish children did not progress beyond primary school, and thousands were forcibly taken to Germany to be Aryanized and reared as Germans.
Asocial were considered to be criminals and useless to the national communities. Thousands of Roma and Sinti people died from gassing, starvation, disease, forced labor, and medical experiments.
In the concentration camps, homosexuals were subjected to harder work, less food, and greater brutality than other inmates. Thousands were put to death. The criminalization and social stigmatization of homosexuals in Europe and the United States remained in force for many years after World War II, and homosexual survivors of Nazi persecution were not acknowledged as victims of the Holocaust.
By the outbreak of the Second World War, thousands of black, mixed race, and people of ethnic minorities had fled Germany, but a great number of those who remained were murdered.
They persecuted and murdered thousands of Catholics, Protestants, and others of Christian affiliation. Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis for their refusal to salute Hitler as savior or to serve in the German army.
6 million Jews, 2/3 of European Jewry, perished in the Holocaust. 1.5 million of these victims were children. The Nazis also murdered millions of other victims. But as Elie Wiesel reminds us, it is true that not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims.
As we ponder how the Shoah came about, we see that it was facilitated by a tactic of Hitler to dehumanize the Jews. The Nazi propaganda brainwashed people into believing the Jews were subhuman and deserved to be treated as such.
There was no privacy or hygiene. The stench and condition were unbearable. Eventually, after 7 nights, the cattle train stopped. The doors were open and we were greeted by shouts from the SS with guns at the ready and the barking of their Alsatian dog. We had arrived at our destination, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp.
I invite pupils of Stratford College Dublin, Ard Scoil na Trinoide at Thai, St. Michael's College Dublin, to read from the Scroll of Names.
Max Heller, Clara Heller, Gazelle Molnar, Sander Molnar,
Oscar Shanovich, Adela Fried, Bella Fried, Katarina Fried,
Elsa
Agnes
Sima,
Fried.
Danny Sima, Chana Mata Saibnu, Raiwaka Saibnu, Baby Saibnu.
Once inside the camp, we saw piles of corpses, the emaciated survivors and the ghost-like victims dying in front of our eyes. On confronting the horrors of the camps, we were glad to be of help, even at this late stage, and all of us felt our military service had been worthwhile.
It is ironic that the nightmare and horrors of the Holocaust also became a defining moment of courage and decency for humanity. Not only those Jews who have been personally saved by the righteous owe them their lives, but also all of their descendants.
Through his work with the Quakers, Hubert Butler succeeded in bringing a number of Jewish refugees to Ireland, despite the Irish government restrictions. He helped them settle in Ireland or secured passage onwards to North and South America, among other destinations. My grandfather described his time in Vienna working to rescue Jews as one of the happiest times of his life. However, he was also profoundly struck by the hatred that was growing and the horrors to which it would inevitably lead.
As I was standing last month next to my dying father's bed in the hospital and saw his bruised arm and his Auschwitz tattoo, I realized that from now on it is my responsibility to tell his story and pass it on to the next generations. Both of my parents were young when they stepped down from the cattle cars on the platform in Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mother was 14 and my father 19. This generation is disappearing. My mother died 14 years ago, and now, after the passing of my father, it is my duty and responsibility to tell the world how my parents' lives were shattered, how in a matter of hours everything and everyone that was dear to them was brutally gone. They saw in their young eyes all the horrors around them. And why? Only because they were Jews.
We have been born with the title second generation, and we have got used to the reality of very small families, at least from one side. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts. But we can also rejoice in our own lives, in our new families, our children and our grandchildren. Hitler did not win. One or both of our parents survived, and we are here, living our lives, looking towards the future.
The Holocaust was mainly about the Jewish people, but its lessons are universal. So many Holocaust victims were betrayed by trust, betrayed by justice, betrayed by the pillars that uphold our very society and our way of life. The burden of damage has been passed through the generations. Our duty is clear. It is not enough to be good. We must know what to do when we face evil. It is not enough to know what we stand for. We must know what we stand against.
You looked into eyes that witnessed the most cataclysmic events ever unleashed by mankind upon mankind. Tell them that you met people who will still be remembered, still talked about, and still wept over 10,000 years from now. Because if they are not, there will be no hope for us at all. The Holocaust happened, and it can happen again. And every one of us, if only for our own self-preservation, has a solemn duty to ensure that nothing like it ever occurs again.